role at the southern border. And so our ministry focuses on primarily in South Texas. And so we work there through the local church, and we do service learning trips and experiences for students and adults. And we try to navigate just what ministry looks like in this region of the country. And so because of COVID, we've, like many of our ministries, right, we've had to start innovating in different ways. And so this particular space that you're looking at is the Border Perspective virtual border journey. And so Border Perspective is working in collaboration with a company called REM5. They are a virtual reality laboratory located here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so together we've compiled basically what it would be in a physical state, a physical gallery space with some photos and stories, and are showcasing it in this very three-dimensional, very immersive type of technology called WebXR. And so WebXR is something, if you think about Zoom meeting virtual reality, and so through the keyboard in our laptops, we're able to, move around, look up and down, and navigate this virtual space. We're using this space to be more educational, and we want to use this space to continue having intentional conversations around things that matter, and that can be reflective to the heart of God. And so I want to welcome you to our virtual border gallery. And so I would love to just start, and let's go into the space and start looking at some of these photos and stories that we have. To give you a brief context, in 2017, my brother Jordan and I, and also a videographer named Jonas, we were actually able to travel the entire length of the U.S. and Mexico border. We started our trip in Brownsville, Texas, and drove through the state of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And most importantly, why we did that was to grasp a larger understanding and broaden the perspective of the border, specifically how God was moving in this region of the country. The narrative that we were hearing was just so polarizing and divisive. But because Jordan and I grew up on the border, and my parents still live there, and they actually pastor a church there, we knew that there was another side of the story. We knew that God was on the move, and God was so vividly present on the margins. And so we wanted to experience that for ourselves, maybe, and we decided to take this journey to try and do that. And so some of the stories and photos that we will be sharing today are regarding that journey. So let's just move out of this room and go into the first story. Part of the way that the gallery is set up is that there's mile markers. Mile markers, tell the story of different photos and scenes that we encountered. And so all along the way, there's we start at mile 25 in Brownsville, Texas, and we'll end at like mile almost 2000 that ends in San Diego, California. And so in this particular scenes here, one of the biggest things when people think about the border is that they think about, the border fence. Obviously, that's something that we hear a lot in the news cycle. That's something that we hear a lot about when it comes to the political climate of the border. And so one thing that was surprising to us as we grew up there, when we grew up on the border fence was not in existence, actually. And so if you think about the entire length of the border, it's about 2,000 miles long. So, and actually there's only about 700 miles that are actually fenced. And this doesn't mean that even those 700 miles are all connected. As a matter of fact, there's large gaps between this fencing that's happening along the border. And so one of the things too that often people think about is that this, that the fence or border security has only been implemented in this current administration, but really part of the border fence that we're actually looking at right now in these photos that go through neighborhoods and farmland. This particular part of the fence was actually funded back in 2006 by President George W. Bush. And, I think this is important for us to know, that just because something's happening right now doesn't mean that it's necessarily, being implemented right away. I think the infrastructure in regards to national security that we're seeing on the border was, has been a part of every presidency and every administration. And so that was something for us to really dive deep into and really understand the history of that. Let's move on to the next section. Tom and Sophia, if you all have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and I will try to answer them as best as possible. Mile 30 takes us to Matamoros, Tamaulipas. Matamoros, Tamaulipas is actually right across the Texas border from Brownsville. And Matamoros, Tamaulipas has been on the news a lot lately. And ultimately, it's been on the news because this is where a large portion of migrants and asylum seekers who are currently going through a legal asylum seeking process actually wait. And they wait not in shelters, not in refugees, but they wait in what has become the largest migrant camp on the U.S.-Mexico border. So by location, these groups of people, of migrants and asylum seekers, are waiting for their legal asylum seeking process, and they wait in Mexico. Our ministry takes volunteer groups there. Prior to COVID, this is one of the main areas that we were volunteering at, because there was at one point over 2,500 people who were displaced, without shelter, without home, without food, without their basic necessities. And one of the things about the Gospels and Scripture, I look back at Matthew 9, 36 and 38, and it's highlighted here above these photos. It says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed, they were helpless, they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so, I think about the opportunity, and I think about how Jesus, right, said this is, there is a lot of opportunity to bring people hope. And it's unfortunate that, for us as a ministry, when we see suffering, we want to step into the humanity of people. And some of the most impactful stories about people encountering Christ and people coming to know Christ is oftentimes in their desperation and in their seeking. And it's been really hard for us as large groups of people continue to be displaced on the border. And so as a church ministry, we, continue to be as faithful as possible and to continue to bring hope to those who are displaced, those who are without a home, those who are in seek of a place to belong. And so both of these photos showcase actually the lady in the center there singing or clapping is my mom, and she comes and sings with some of the families who are there with their little kids. Most of the migrants and asylum seekers at this camp are from Central America. They're from the Northern Triangle, which is known, as some of the countries like Honduras and Nicaragua and El Salvador from Central America. And then also the other picture is also my dad, who he not only shares a word of hope, but also the gospel, because ultimately I think we're all looking for that place of belonging and that hope that only Jesus can bring to our lives. We know that this experience, as we're navigating through it, is not necessarily, replicate a physical experience, but it's through the storytelling that we can broaden our perspectives. This next photo takes us to mile marker 65 in Alamo, Texas. If you get really close to the photo, you can actually hear some mariachi music playing. I highlighted and I like this photo because mariachi music is just a musical expression, right, of the border, the U.S. and Mexico border in many ways. One of the things about mariachi music is that mariachi music is taught in a lot of local schools all around South Texas, and every time that you go to birthday parties, quinceañeras, church events even, or important celebrations, you might just get a glimpse of mariachi music. It's just part of the culture, you know? So that's something cool that I love about something cool that I love about this platform is that it's extremely immersive. You know, there's opportunity for us to highlight music, highlight video, and just have conversations with each other. But let's keep moving on to mile marker 70. Mile marker 70 takes us to San Juan, Texas. And so on our journey in 2017, we met up with various different people who lived along the border, local residents, artists, pastors, aid workers. And in this specific scene, we met up with a group of farmers, and we actually, the day we met them, they were actually having a celebratory march, because back in 1977, farm workers from South Texas started a march from San Juan, Texas, right on the U.S.-Mexico border, all the way to Washington, D.C., to continue advocating for basic human rights and the dignity of the farm worker. And so in 2017, when we met up with this march of farm workers, it was a celebratory march, because even today in 2020, right, like, farm workers are essential. I think during COVID, we see how agriculture is so essential to continue feeding our families all around the nation. But most importantly, the people that do this type of work are essential and valuable in the work and dignified work that they do. And so it was intriguing to us because, you know, there's been this desire for the dignity of the farm worker to be respected and well compensated. And it was, you know, to think about like some of the stories that we heard from some of these people were that they walked about 20 miles a day from South Texas to Austin, through, you know, the Midwest, and eventually getting to Washington, D.C. And so this was just to advocate for the work that they do, and to be valued and respected and dignified. And yeah, so Jordan, my brother Jordan, was huge photographer, and him and I, as we did the trip together, he captured some great images as well. So as we move over to mile marker 73, we find ourselves in Far, Texas. Far, Texas is actually where I grew up. I went to school there. I grew up there, have many friends from Far, Texas, and my parents currently live in Far. And Far, Texas is a border town right across from Reynosa, Tamaulipas, which is a Mexican border town on the other side. And part of my growing up was that I always grew up in ministry myself, whether I liked it or not. That's part of my ministry story, right? Like, just because I grew up in a household of pastors and Christian ministry, like, I was at church whether I wanted to be there or not. And part of this was early on, my parents started to embed in us, compassion and empathy for the people of God, for all people who were created in the image of God. And we believe that every person, right, was created in the image of God. And so my greatest examples for me growing up are my parents. Most of the photos that you're looking at are my mom and my dad. And in one photo, you see them crossing the border into Mexico to do ministry. Another, you see them visiting with families and people who are displaced on the border and are currently in refuge centers or shelters along the border. And so when I saw the need that they were meeting through their local church back in 2017 and 18, and when there was an influx of a lot of need and a lot of people coming through the border, I felt that we needed to have more support from the national church because their small immigrant church could not keep up with the need that there was there. And so in many ways, that's the origin of Border Perspective as a ministry. That's how we got started, because the local church was seeing a lot more need that they could meet. And so that's when we started engaging with other churches around the nation and inviting people to come and be, just continue to be supportive of the work that we were doing and continue to share the love of God, to displace people. And so my parents have been doing this work for about 30 years. And the need continues to be fluid. The need continues to change. But one of the things is that our family continues to be present in meeting the need of people on the border. So let's move on to mile 80 here in Hidalgo, Texas. So mile 80, you'll see some photos of, actually this is my good friend Marcy. You can see her in the black and white photo, and then on the left, and then on the right, that's a photo of a migrant asylum-seeking family holding their child, and a volunteer putting shoes on their feet. In this story, we call it Zapatos, which is in English, it's shoes, but it's really about the journey. Marcy was on a Border Perspective trip with us sometime, I believe 2 years ago now, and she wrote this story because she was extremely impacted by seeing the need at these shelters and also being able to provide for some of these families. In this particular story, Marcy finds herself sharing the story. What would be the story of this boy who is in the midst of migrating from his homeland, which is Central America, into the U.S. And Marcy's interaction with this family, means finding new shoes for this little boy. And unfortunately, she struggled to find the right shoes that would fit him. And at the end of the day, they did find some white shoes that fit him. But she goes on to recall and tells the story of, if these shoes could tell every step of the way, every step of the journey, what have these shoes been through? And most importantly, a shoe is just a representation of the life, right, of the person who is wearing those shoes, because really it's those experiences that these families and this boy have walked through that have really impacted their journey to a point where they now find themselves at a shelter in South Texas with volunteers trying to meet their needs. And so this Marcy continues to tell the story, about what possibly could have happened in this boy's journey without really with really trying to dignify and respect, obviously, this important journey that this family has been going through. And so stories like this one, we've encountered in our ministry a lot of women, a lot of families with kids, a lot of people who would be vulnerable populations, and we've encountered them in a place, in a vulnerable state, in a place where they need to find hope and they're longing for hope. And so as we continue to share with them, we know that as a ministry, there are ministries that help people with their legal circumstances. Our ministry is about presence. Our ministry is about praying with people, bringing them a glimpse of hope, feeding them if they're hungry, and providing new shoes to them if they need a pair of shoes. But we also know that ultimately we want to provide them with encouragement and hope and pray with them as they continue to navigate this difficult journey of migrating from what used to be their home to a new place. This interaction took place at the Catholic Refuge Center in McAllen, Texas, and I believe, Dominic, some Baylor students have actually volunteered there in the past, right? Mm, mm, yeah, mm, yeah, yeah, exactly, for sure. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, you like you mentioned, I think these stories are impactful and powerful, right? And as we step into walking with people who are the owners of these stories and who have lived these stories, I think there's a huge way for us to empathize in their pain and to mourn with them in their sorrow, but then also to practically help, right? And I think that's where we become the hands and feet of Christ, when we step into the suffering with others and we can tangibly meet some of the needs. So let's move on to this mile marker 86 over in McAllen, Texas. So nice, nice. I like seeing you guys navigate this space, and I'm excited that you are here with me. So these next photos are also the interior place of a migrant center in McAllen, Texas. And so at one point, these walls were freshly painted, freshly painted in gray, and they were completely, fresh and new. And when at the core of people migrating and waiting in these shelters, they would either stand up and wait in lines or literally sit on the floor and wait, whether it was for a process for their documents or a process to receive some sort of donation, right? Whether it was food or a meal or clothing. And so in their desperation, in their waiting, these photos highlight the trauma that many migrant families and asylum seeking families face when they are in their waiting. As people were waiting, they would start chipping away at some of this paint on the walls. And this story is titled White Flakes because on the floor there would be a remainder of paint flakes from people picking at these walls. And that is the traumatic experience. If you think about even yourself, like, I know that when I'm anxious, when I'm nervous, for example, I start biting my nails. That's how I try to cope with the situation. That's how I try to alleviate some of the things that I'm feeling. And so in this specific shelter in McAllen, Texas, some of the families who were going through this waiting period would start chipping away at the paint. And it was an incredible scene to see it in real life, because what was once a freshly painted window or walls, I mean, all of a sudden, was a um, white flakes all on the floor. And I think that tells a much larger story about the emotional toll and trauma that many families in their waiting, are experiencing. Let's move into actually this room behind us. Tell you a little bit more about Border Perspective in here. You guys able to make it in? Perfect. Bless you in here, Dom. Nice. Great. So part of I was sharing with Dominic that part of our work on the border is a lot about storytelling. Storytelling for us is huge. Even in the mission field, truly believe that, stories of people and being in proximity with people and knowing their journey allows us to understand them a little bit better. And so I want to just show you this quick video. Some of the scenes from this video are actually from the migrant center that we looked at some photos earlier from Matamoros, the Mexican side across Brownsville, Texas. And so this video is actually my brother talking about the importance of storytelling. And so as you can see, storytelling is a huge part of how we approach our ministry at Border Perspective. So let me just click play here.
Matter. There's mothers, there's fathers, there's sons, and then there's daughters, and they all have a story. And if we just take 1 second, if we just take 1 minute, 1 hour of our time to listen to them, we might be able to get impacted by it. We might be like, a conversation might start because of it. And maybe we might not agree, like we might completely disagree, but it'll take us somewhere and we can talk about it. And it doesn't have to be like how rhetoric is in the news media right now, where everyone is so aggressive towards each other and know this and know that. No, let's just have healthy conversation through impactful stories.
So impactful stories, as you all have been hearing and listening to, right, are a huge part of what we do at Border Perspective. And stories, I think, bring us closer to one another as we all navigate this journey that is called life. And most importantly, how God is working and moving, and the need for God that we all have around us. And so I think that video does a great visualization of just some of the scenes that we typically encounter and the scenes that people are living in as they are migrating from one place to another. So let's go out and start in mile marker 843, and that'll take us to El Paso, Texas. Oh, just like in real life, you can't go through the physical item. Yeah. So this mile marker 843 is titled La Biblia es la verdad. The Bible is the truth. And so as we were journeying the border with my brother, we actually found ourselves over an overlook in El Paso, Texas, that overlooks Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And on one of the mountaintops from the overlook that we saw this huge sign that read La Biblia es la verdad. And so as I started digging deeper into why is that there, why is it very visible from the US side, why is it in the midst of these two communities that seem super intertwined, and what was the purpose of it? And so I found that an evangelical pastor actually in 1987 to show the unity between the evangelical Christians in Juarez and El Paso, actually asked the city for permission to paint this message on the mountainside. And actually, he was never like deemed like a permit or anything, but the city, really respected their freedom of expression. And they said that they didn't see anything necessarily wrong with it, that it was actually a positive message on that mountainside. But whether you live on the Mexican side of Ciudad Juarez or El Paso on the U.S. side, there's no way you can miss that very encouraging message that is, the Bible is the truth. And so that just tells you too how much faith is preeminent on the border, whether it's on the Mexican or American side of the border. I think that just highlights the strength of faith in pastors and leaders and in churches around those communities. Let's move over to mile marker 947, which will Texas now jump the border over to New Mexico. We found ourselves at a nearby McDonald's ranch in Hashida, New Mexico at one point. Hashida, New Mexico had become a ghost town for many. At one point, this used to be a military camp, especially in the early 1900s. Many people say that this town served as a U.S. Base to hunt Mexican icons like Pancho Villa, in northern Mexico, who were part of the revolution in Mexico. And this town at one point had railroads going through it, and this mile is about 30 miles from the Mexico-New Mexico border. But in 1960, the trains stopped passing through there, and so Hashida today has less than 50 residents on the border. And it was interesting for us to see the signs of life, but also how it's become to crumble and start to become a ghost town on the New Mexico desert. And so I would say that my brother and I both felt that it was an eerie feeling as we were going through and navigating our journey through this historic, but also very intriguing New Mexico ghost town. Our next photo, mile marker 1188, takes us to Douglas, Arizona. All along the border, we kept seeing these kind of, hot air balloons in the distance until we got closer. We realized that this was some sort of radar systems, and sure enough, with research, we found that these were actually called tethered aerostat radar systems, and it's basically Border Patrol's eye in the sky, and they stretch all the way up to 10,000 feet up in the air, all along the southern U.S. and Mexico border. And so in 2017, there was about 8 of these blimps all across the border, actually with one being in Puerto Rico, another one in, southern Florida, and then all across the 4 states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And so the radius that these systems detect is about a 200-mile radius once they're up 10,000 feet in the air. And so some of this technology and these systems are actually also used to secure the borders on the Palestine and Israel border as well. Actually, and as a matter of fact, I believe that the company who designs this system is actually a company based in Israel, and I believe the U.S. government contracts this technology with that company. And so one of the intriguing things about the cost of these systems, very advanced systems, is that one of these blimps, right, or TAR systems as we call them, it costs about $9 million to produce and to be fully outfitted. And so, if you imagine if there's 8 or 12 of those all along the border, that gives you just an understanding of how much our government spends in national security, right? Just in those systems alone. And I think that's good for us to understand because as people of faith, I think we should know not only and understand how to be compassionate and empathetic to those who are suffering, but also understand where our money goes, also understand what our money funds and the importance of, just securing our borders. And so that's something that in our border journey and as people, navigate the border with us, we highlight these conversations because it's important for us to seek knowledge and understand the importance of this. We'll move over to mile 1215 that will take us over to Arizona. Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora are a binational, bicultural community on the Arizona-Mexico border. And if there was one day that was extremely impactful for me, was this day on my 9-day border trip. And I say this because when I read Matthew 25:35 and it says, I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me a drink, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. When I see and reflect on these words of Jesus, I want my faith to be a reflection of the gospel. I want my faith to be a reflection practically of who Jesus was. And so in this day, Peg Bowden, the lady there in the pink, took my brother and I and Jonas on a journey across to a migrant shelter in Arizona. And this shelter is actually run by Jesuit nuns and priests and volunteers, local volunteers from both sides of the border. And not only was the fencing infrastructure, vividly in through the desert, but also the need that I experienced there was that some of the volunteers and at the shelter were literally helping heal and wound some of the wounds that people had from trying to cross the desert of Arizona illegally. And that was the first time that I actually had come across, someone doing really important and pivotal work. I think no matter, people's circumstances, but they were literally cleaning their wounds and their feet who were broken and bloody. And for me, my mind went to where else have I seen this, right? And I look back to the Gospels, and I see Jesus, right, like cleaning his disciples' feet. And that was a humble experience for Jesus because I think that's where he shows us that, humility and caring for the others. And for me, that was a huge lesson and convicted me. It really convicted my faith. And I realized that's why in many ways that day, I feel like I connected the need that was happening in South Texas also with the need happening in front of my eyes and how I needed to be more involved in this type of work. If I saw suffering, to bring hope and healing and try to do as much as I could to come to the aid of, the other. And so El Comedor exists still today, and it's still run by volunteers and a Jesuit group on the Arizona and Mexico border, and they continue to do great work there. And for me, that was one of the most transforming days of that trip. Along that same journey, that same day, if we move over to mile marker 1220, we look at the photo of Enrique. And Enrique is a guy that we met about, I would say 11 o'clock in the morning the day we were there. And Enrique was actually recently deported from the US into Mexico. And we started talking with him, and you often hear about deportations on the news or you read it in articles. But as we talked with Enrique, we realized that he had spent 11 years in prison for a crime he had committed in the United States. And so obviously Enrique had a criminal background, which was the cause of his deportation into Mexico. And so that they also, the government withdrew his green card at that point, so he was no longer legal to stay in the United States. And so as we continued talking with Enrique, he didn't go into detail about the crime he committed, but he did mention that his actions had consequences, and that he was paying for what he did. He actually said this phrase: criminals like me have to deal with the consequences. The bad decisions we make, he said, unfortunately, it's because of people like me that a lot of hardworking immigrants, even those who just want to provide for their families, get labeled as criminals. I could feel that Enrique felt conviction about his current situation, and that he saw himself as a part of the immigration problem that was impacting and affecting many people around the country. And most importantly, I saw that there was remorse, even in the tough spirit that Enrique showed to us, But he got deported into this unknown place in the Mexican desert, where he now had to find a way to start over. And so that interaction was also really impacting and hard for me, because I came face to face with somebody who had been in federal prison, deported, committed a high crime that caused deportation, but yet also had a pivotal perspective that helped me shape an understanding, a larger and broader understanding of stories that we often only hear about on the news or read through articles. We move over to the last set of photos is in mile marker 1773. We find ourselves in the Algodones dunes. And so this is the last part of this stretch of the border. Most of it, my brother and I, we drove it on the US side of the border. But in Tecate, Baja California, across from about an hour from San Diego, we actually had some friends in Tecate, and Anna and her husband Peter actually hosted us there, and they drove us from Tecate to Tijuana on the Mexican side of the border. And Anna and Peter are local pastors there of a church, and they also do missions on that side of the border. And so part of these photos highlight just the difference in landscape that the border brings, the difference of nature, from the San Diego, Tijuana beach to the mountainous regions of California, but then also the dunes as you enter California from Arizona. And yet at Friendship Park in San Diego, the families who are separated on one side of the border and the other, and how they come together through this barrier that, in some cases allows them to still communicate and interact with each other. After 2,000 miles on the border, we saw a lot. We heard many stories. We heard many perspectives, and we saw how the landscape changed in many, many ways. And so this experience, I could not help but get emotional after 9 days on the road. And ultimately, at one point after the trip, as I started to really understand what is my role, and I started to question, what do I do now with this experience? In many ways gives you a glimpse into why border perspective exists. And why it's pivotal for us as people of faith to try and understand Lord, how are you working? Lord, how are you calling me? What is my responsibility to the Great Commission? How do I partake, right, into the broader sense of loving, my neighbor? And so for me, obviously, through this visual experience, this is um, a new perspective that I gained through this journey. And so I hope that you all also gained another perspective of maybe a topic that we only or sometimes don't hear enough about. So thanks for joining us. Mhm. Yeah, and I appreciate and thank you, Dominic, Sophia. Thank you for coming on. And for those of you who are watching via Zoom or the live stream on social media, thank you all for joining us. Feel free to rewatch this and continue the conversation with us. You can find more information about Border Perspective at borderperspective.org or any social media platform as well. And so let's just continue to be good stewards of the faith that we have, right? And continue to love each other as God intended. So thank you all so much. Have a good day.